Hello, people. How's it going? Well, this will be on culture and politics and how they really don't get along too well, and they're sort of like sibling rivalries, like Cain and Abel, or the British colonies and the Crown, or like other analogies I could come up with that almost work. I mean, what is culture? The making of a civilization. Yes, that is helpful to have culture to make a civilization because, just because you have a people doesn't make it a culture. Or at least not one that would be considered civilized. Headhunters are not civilized. I don't want to hear it. And cannibals are not civilized. They may have a culture, but they ain't civilized. What makes civilization into a civilization worth having? What makes it a wasted civilization? One, the making of a civilization is the moment a people decide to make their history worth recording, worth remembering, worth writing down, worth celebrating, worth basically just worth remembering in a lot of ways. I mean, worth people remembering. I mean, that is what civilization is about. It's creating something that will be remembered, that at least have some long lasting legacy. Even, I mean, cultures like the Etruscans, the Romans, the ancient Greeks, they're gone, but their culture's not, their civilization's not, their civilization is still remembered, though it may not be a different type of Greek civilization now. It still has roots in its past. What makes culture into a civilization? Worth noting, its lasting influence on the history of those who follow after. Greek civilization really made Western civilization what it is. The idea of democracy and the idea of literature and the idea of writing and history and it just Hellenism really did do a lot for the East anyway. I mean, and for what we would call the Middle East, where Israel is and Syria is and all those other countries, and either further east. Civilization and culture need to work together, though. They have to have a common goal, a common bond, a common reason. They have to have something. What makes it worth noting? Those behind it, those who are promoting it, those who study it, those who write about it, those who govern it, those who write literature about it. Culture is civilization worth taking note of. Like I mentioned, headhunters and cannibals, though they have a culture, it's not exactly a civilized one. The Greeks, I like picking on the Greeks. The Greeks had a culture. They still do. I mean, even after thousands of years, they're still Greeks. They still have a history. They still have an amazing history. I mean, culturally wise, history wise, and language wise. And I mean, if it weren't for the Greeks, a lot of what we know as the Bible probably wouldn't have been written as it is now. Hellenism may have had its Jewishness may have had a problem with Hellenism, but Hellenism really did help the Jewish culture to grow, thrive, to keep going, to figure out what it wants. I mean, what makes it a wasted civilization? As I keep saying, because I think it's probably one of the bottom of the barrel ways of putting it. Headhunting and cannibalism are not good. Not good. No, bad. But then again, you have the Assyrians, who are a highly advanced culture and civilization, who literally would be considered the Germans of the 1930s of the ancient world. They uprooted entire peoples. They wiped out entire peoples. They uprooted civilizations. The reason the kingdom of Israel collapsed and was destroyed and the Dispersia existed is because of the Assyrians. But a people who have risen above the worst or barbaric aspects of the people is a civilization that's worth noting even if it started out badly. I mean, there were a lot of cultures probably that started out originally badly, particularly the early civilizations, particularly the early cultures. The early culture is it's almost an odd word though, because what is a culture? It's something worth doing. It's something worth remembering. It's something that just makes a people. Or there'll be more than one part of the subject. This is just sort of an introduction to what I think I'm going to be doing. The point of civilization is to be civilized. Question mark. A simplistic answer, but a correct one. Humanity from the beginning has sought to be civilized despite its tendency to kill one another in mass or in lots of wars. Civilization, then, is not immune to the more darker part of the history of humanity, but it should be inspired to rise above such things. Civilization is that philosophy between mankind's two natures, the creative and the destructive. And that is what civilization is. Culture is that striving to be better than your barbaric side, be better than your nature to destroy everything you come across. At least it used to. Well, I'm not going to deal with modern today's culture. This is ancient culture for the moment. This is culture worth remembering. I'll get to today's culture eventually, believe me. What is politics? The government of the civilization that makes the laws and defends the civilization. Question mark. The leaders or rulers that the culture elects into. Yes, I am reading this. Into that position. The instruments by which heads or leaders or rulers stay in power. This is politics. Which, as you all know, I don't like politics. But it is a necessary evil, unfortunately. That is what politics is and always will be. It's unavoidable. 1. The government of a civilization that makes the laws and defends the civilization. This is political philosophy, principles, and purpose. That is what politics should be, anyway. If the leaders or rulers of the civilization elected into the position. Yes, I probably wrote that wrong, but politics is about elections, people being governed by other people that they've elected or put into office, or kings who have ruled and conquered other nations. And yes, that was my phone. The instrument in which leaders or rulers stay in power. Now, that's definitely politics. I mean, see, to me, politics has a tendency. See, this is not the politics, my nose. Politics to me, I'm not dealing with today's politics. Today's politics, I think, is gotten to the point where it's basically corrupted everything it touches. It shouldn't do that. But there should be a balance between politics and culture. Culture should always win. Because without culture, you don't really have anything worth governing. Because there's nothing there, you have lawlessness. Civilization and culture have got to work together to keep politics under control. I have nothing against the concept of philosophy of politics. Philosophical, political theory or political philosophy is needed. Every civilization needs it. But it needs culture far more than it needs politics. It needs far more culture than it needs people with self-important egos that want to rule other people's lives. They have a tendency to not like culture. Most people who run for office, most people who are political in all their aspects, have no appreciation for culture. They have no appreciation for anything other than their own rule. The Renaissance, in a lot of ways, however, contradicts that. Because a lot of the Renaissance kings and queens and popes, they liked culture because it was worldly. They liked culture because it made them look good. But man, you threaten their power, and they will do things to you. It's itching my nose. I don't know what it is. But anyway. I mean, the Renaissance is a good example of what it is. When politics and culture pretty much can work together up to a point. Up to a point, and I mean a fine point. Because the Renaissance popes were the most worldly bunch of people you're ever going to meet. And they were. They like the arts. They like the culture. They like this, that, and the other. But don't you dare threaten their power, and don't you dare question anything they say or do. That's when culture and politics have a problem. At least in my mind, anyway. Man, I don't know what it is. It's itching like crazy. And no, I don't snort coke. Just itches for the reason. I mean, the Renaissance was about learning and about science, the growth of science, the beginning of real science with Copernicus. And eventually leading up to Galileo and Kepler and all kinds of other wonderful things. Read that book. That book does a great job of talking about the Renaissance up to the present time. An excellent book, by the way. Anyway, but the Renaissance, the kings and queens of the Renaissance promoted culture, but they held on to power, boy. They held on to that power, and they were not letting it go, and they did not care. So there is a struggle between culture and politics. And maybe I may not be explaining this very well, but culture creates civilization. That's why the Renaissance is so fascinating. That's why it's so interesting a time period. Because the modern world, it really got going at that point. And, it really did. The humanities were being discussed. There was Erasmus, and I'll even say it, even Thomas More is worth reading. Even he was up to a point a humanist, up to a point humanist. He wasn't like Erasmus. I mean, he had his issues. But there was learning, there was culture, there was art, there was Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, Donatello. I mean, these were men of culture, men of the arts, men of civilization, learning, and politics constantly kept getting in the way. Politics, as long as you didn't threaten politics and you let politics have a little bit of its say in there, it was a fine relationship. But believe me, it was amazing me sometimes that it survived. Here's me again. That's one of my other notes are. Should either one influence or affect the other? Yeah, culture should. Culture should always affect the society, the civilization, and politics should keep its nose out of it. It doesn't. It doesn't know how. Politics does not like being second banana to anybody or anything or any other philosophy. Yes or no? To what degree? Culture should always be number one. Philosophy should always be number one. Civilization could probably survive a little bit with less politics and more culture. That's why it's called a civilization. That's what makes civilization. The Spartans, which I pick, was not a culture that is a culture where its politics, which was militaristic, overrode everything. It really didn't have much of a culture. It had one, but it was so minuscule that you can almost say it almost didn't have one at all, which is probably unfair to the Spartans. They probably did have one up to a point. But if you want to talk about an unequal reliance between politics and culture, the Spartans were more politically, militaristically minded, and where are they? They're gone. Their civilization is gone. It got swallowed up by a bigger culture known as Greece and Rome eventually. Okay. What limit should there be on its influence? What is more important? I'm talking about politics here, and its it's an antagonist and protagonist culture. Which is more important? Should they be natural allies? Well, they should be, but they're not going to be. Or enemies. They shouldn't be enemies, but politics makes enemies out of everything because it wants to tell culture and civilization via culture what to do, how to think, blah, 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 blah. That's not very historian, though, is it? Blah, blah, blah is not a historian's way of saying things. You should say that. Should they get along? Yeah, they should get along. Politics should get out of the way of culture. So civilization is not going to go anywhere strictly on politics. The Spartans proved this. They don't exist anymore. They're gone. The Greeks are still here because their culture out really their culture actually outlived them. Because once the Romans came along, the Romans said, "Hey, we like that culture. We're going to borrow it at the tip of a sword." But they did take it. They did use it, and it survived. It survived because the Romans took it. Well, that'll happen when you conquer people. The problem is the problem is one is supposed to benefit the other, but one has a tendency to overtake the other. Culture is about that civilizing influence that creates a civil culture that creates civilization worth achieving. My handwriting is terrible, which is true. Culture it, is supposed to create the wanting, the desire, the need, the purpose behind creating civilizations. It's supposed to rise people above being barbaric, above the barbaric. And as I keep using the term, I might as well above being headhunters and cannibals. Politics is about governing, not creating culture, and it is. The modern world is a good testimony to what happens when politics tries to create cultures. All it does is create tyranny. All it does is create stagnant, boring, ideological, woke agendas. That's not culture, that's politics. Politics is about the governing, not creating culture. Culture is creating beyond the abilities of politics. Politics cannot create culture. I don't care how these people try on a certain aisle of political thought, you will never create a culture that will survive. People who are not allowed to think for themselves or create for themselves will never truly create a civilization worth remembering or lasting. I mean, the Soviet Union didn't last long. Sure, they had people that were creating, but they were being strictly told what to do and not what to do, and the Soviet Union is gone. The Russian mindset is still here, but the rest of those communists, y'all get into that some other time. Culture needs sometimes politics. Culture needs something politics lacks. That's what I should have wrote. I misread. Culture needs something politics lacks. Imagination. Politics doesn't have imagination. It doesn't have time for imagination. It doesn't care about imagination. It wants to rule. It wants to govern people. It wants to control things. That's all politics does. People who think politics is their friend are in for a rude awakening. Politics is political philosophy, in a sense, is culturally interesting, but in practice, politics is corrupting. It gets in the way. I mean, Galileo was interested in the cultural aspirations of science. So I'm just going to say cultural, and I know he was a scientist, but let's just say culture instead. He just wanted to do science. He just wanted to do cultural things, whole science things. And the church constantly was trying to get him, not at first, but after a while, they were just determined to stop him from doing anything. Because the church, whether people like it or not, was political. Most of what the church was governed by was politics, not religion, not Christianity, not the Bible. I don't care what anyone tells me. I know this from that because I've read history. And partly because Galileo also went against the one Greek philosopher that the church loved and believed anything scientific he said. Aristotle could do no wrong. That's where the church got the idea from the flat earth, by the way, which the church really didn't believe in the first place, by the way. But Galileo came along and said, Aristotle's wrong. And the church basically had a hissy fit. Anyway, politics and culture, or culture and politics. I'm trying to stop this at 20 minutes. Culture doesn't need politics. It just really doesn't. Politics stifles culture. stifles civilization because people who rule don't like people who think. That's just the way it works. Anyway, I will probably do another part on this subject at some point. But anyway, hopefully I didn't bore you too much. Well, behave yourselves, people, because you know I'm not going to. Another cold day here in Minnesota. Behave yourselves. Subscribe, like, share, comment. If you do subscribe, all I'm asking is you subscribe on the Facebook, on the YouTube channel comment section. Don't subscribe anywhere else. If you're gonna comment on my YouTube channel, please. Thank you. Behave yourselves, people. Later. Later.